Welcome to another episode of Mind Unveiled, the podcast where we dive deep into the lives and ideas of the thinkers who have fundamentally reshaped our world. Today we're embarking on a journey through the life of a man whose name is synonymous with one of the most transformative scientific theories in human history, Charles Robert Darwin. Now, when you hear Darwin, your mind probably jumps straight to evolution and natural selection, and you'd be right to do so. But what I want to explore today is not just what Darwin discovered, but how he discovered it, and the fascinating, often surprising story of the man behind the monumental ideas. Because Darwin wasn't some flamboyant genius struck by a sudden lightning bolt of insight. He was, by all accounts, a patient, meticulous, and even somewhat anxious observer. A man who spent decades quietly accumulating evidence before he dared to unleash his most controversial idea upon the world. His story is one of quiet persistence, a testament to the power of sustained curiosity and rigorous, painstaking work. We'll trace his path from his comfortable but uncertain beginnings in Shrewsbury, England, through a truly transformative voyage that reordered his entire way of seeing the natural world, to the eventual publication of On the Origin of Species and the quieter decades of study that followed. We'll even delve into the enormous legacy he left behind, both the celebrated and the sometimes troubling aspects. So settle in, because this isn't just a science lesson, it's a human story, full of twists, turns, and the incredible power of observation. Let's start at the very beginning. Charles Robert Darwin was born on February 12, 1809, in Shrewsbury, a market town nestled in Shropshire, England. He wasn't born into obscurity, quite the opposite. He arrived into a family of considerable intellectual and social standing, a pedigree that would profoundly shape his life. His father, Robert Waring Darwin, was a highly successful physician, known for his shrewd judgment and an imposing physical presence. Imagine a man well over 6 feet tall, a formidable figure to his children, and a true patriarch. On his mother's side, Susanna Darwin, née Wedgwood, came from the incredibly wealthy Wedgwood pottery family, one of the great industrial fortunes of the era. So, young Charles inherited this fascinating dual legacy: the intellectual rigor and medical tradition from his father's side, and the industrial wealth and Enlightenment rationalism from his mother's. This combination would grant him both financial independence, allowing him the freedom to pursue his scientific passions without immediate economic pressure, and a natural inclination toward empirical inquiry. But the intellectual currents ran even deeper in his family. Perhaps just as significant to Charles's formation was his paternal grandfather, Erasmus Darwin. Now, Erasmus was a fascinating character in his own right, a physician, inventor, and poet who had himself speculated about the transmutation of species decades before Charles was even born. In works like Zoonomia, Erasmus had laid out evolutionary ideas that, while speculative and largely unsupported by hard evidence, clearly established that the notion of species changing over time was already circulating within the family's intellectual atmosphere. It wasn't a completely alien concept. It was a seed that had been planted, waiting for the right ground and the right mind to truly flourish. And on his mother's side, Josiah Wedgwood, the founder of the pottery empire, embodied that same spirit of Enlightenment inquiry, but applied to industry and commerce. It's no surprise, then, that Charles would later marry his first cousin, Emma Wedgwood, further intertwining these two powerful family lines and their intellectual legacies. Tragically, Charles's mother, Susanna, died when he was only 8 years old. It's striking that in his later recollections, Darwin had strikingly few memories of her, suggesting the profound impact of this early loss. He was subsequently raised primarily under the watchful eyes of his older sisters and his formidable father. As a boy, Charles attended a local day school before enrolling, at age 9, in Shrewsbury School, a boarding institution that, like many of its time, emphasized classical languages, Latin and Greek, over the natural sciences that would come to define his life's work. Darwin's own description of his education there was, to put it mildly, withering. He wrote that the school taught him almost nothing of scientific value, and that the rigid classical curriculum left him largely unstimulated. By his own admission, he was an unremarkable student, far more interested in collecting beetles, shells, and minerals, and in conducting amateur chemistry experiments with his older brother Erasmus in a garden shed than in memorizing Latin declensions. This early passion for collecting is something we really need to dwell on, because it reveals a trait that would define Darwin's entire scientific career, an almost obsessive drive to gather, catalog, and compare specimens. Long before he had any grand theory to explain what he was observing, Darwin was, quite simply, training himself. He was honing the discipline of careful natural historical observation, a skill that would become invaluable. His father, however, was far from impressed. Worried that Charles was wasting his life on idle pastimes, Robert Darwin is famously reported to have told him, with a mixture of exasperation and perhaps genuine concern, "You care for nothing but shooting, dogs, and rat-catching, and you will be a disgrace to yourself and all your family." Little did he know, those idle pastimes were the very foundation upon which his son would build a scientific revolution. In 1825, at the tender age of 16, Charles was sent to the University of Edinburgh to study medicine, following directly in his father's and grandfather's footsteps. The experience, however, was largely a disaster. Darwin found the lectures dull, tedious, and uninspiring. The anatomy demonstrations were grim, a stark reality of early 19th century medicine. He was particularly disturbed by witnessing surgery performed without anesthesia, an ordeal that reportedly caused him to flee the operating theater on more than one occasion. Imagine the horror of those scenes, the screams, the blood, the sheer pain. It quickly became clear, to Charles himself, and eventually to his father, that medicine was emphatically not his calling. Yet Edinburgh wasn't entirely without its value. It was there that Darwin was exposed to a livelier scientific culture than the classical confines of Shrewsbury School had offered. He joined the Plinian Society, a student group devoted to natural history, where he encountered more radical and materialist ideas about nature that circulated on the fringes of respectable science. He studied marine invertebrates under the tutelage of Robert Grant, a proponent of the transmutationist ideas of the French naturalist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Grant introduced Darwin to Lamarck's theories of species change, the idea that species could transform over time, often through the inheritance of acquired characteristics. While Darwin later recalled being more startled than persuaded by them at the time, these ideas certainly planted a seed. Crucially, Darwin also learned taxidermy from John Edmonstone, a freed South American slave living in Edinburgh. The conversations between these two men were significant. Edmonstone provided the young Darwin with some of his earliest exposure to first-hand accounts of tropical natural history, painting vivid pictures of distant lands and exotic creatures. But he also exposed Darwin to the moral horrors of slavery, a subject about which Darwin would maintain strong abolitionist convictions throughout his life, convictions that would later influence his views on the shared humanity of all people. By 1827, it was abundantly clear to Darwin's father that his son would never become a physician. Rather than allow Charles to drift without direction, Robert Darwin proposed an alternative respectable career, the clergy. In that era, becoming an Anglican clergyman offered a comfortable living, intellectual pursuits, and ample time for natural history studies, which were often seen as a way to appreciate God's creation. So in 1828, Charles was enrolled at Christ's College, Cambridge, to pursue a Bachelor of Arts degree as a preparatory step toward becoming a clergyman. Cambridge, much like Edinburgh, did little to engage Darwin academically in the formal sense. He described his years there as largely wasted with respect to his official studies, though he did manage to pass his final examinations respectably in 1831. But what mattered far more than the prescribed curriculum were the relationships Darwin formed with several key mentors who would shape the entire trajectory of his future. Chief among these was John Stevens Henslow, a professor of botany at Cambridge. Their friendship grew so close that Darwin became known among his peers as the man who walks with Henslow. Henslow, a keen naturalist himself, encouraged Darwin's growing enthusiasm for natural history, botany, and geology. It was Henslow who would later recommend Darwin for the opportunity that would utterly define his life. Darwin also studied geology under Adam Sedgwick, one of the founding figures of modern geological science. In the summer of 1831, just before the pivotal moment, Darwin accompanied Sedgwick on a geological field expedition through Wales, gaining invaluable hands-on training in stratigraphy, the study of rock layers, and field observation. This practical experience would prove absolutely essential during his later travels. It was also during his Cambridge years that Darwin read two books that left a profound impression on him. The first was John Herschel's Preliminary Discourse on the Study of Natural Philosophy, which laid out an inspiring vision of science as a unified, rational pursuit of causal explanation. It painted a picture of science not as a collection of isolated facts, but as a grand endeavor to understand the fundamental laws governing the universe. The second was Alexander von Humboldt's Personal Narrative, an account of the great naturalist explorer's travels through South America. Humboldt's vivid descriptions of tropical landscapes and exotic wildlife absolutely ignited in Darwin a passionate desire to travel and see such wonders for himself. He even began making informal plans with a Cambridge friend to visit the Canary Islands. The world was calling him, and he was ready to answer. Then, in the summer of 1831, shortly after Darwin returned from his geological fieldwork with Sedgwick, a letter arrived that would change the course of his life, and indeed, the course of scientific history. Henslow had been asked to recommend a naturalist, essentially a well-educated gentleman companion, more than a formal scientific officer, to accompany Captain Robert Fitzroy on a survey voyage of HMS Beagle. The ship was tasked with charting the coastline of South America and completing a series of longitudinal measurements around the globe. Fitzroy, an aristocratic and intensely religious young captain, desired an educated companion of appropriate social standing to share his table and conversation during the long, isolating voyage. Henslow, recognizing Darwin's passion and aptitude, suggested his protege as a strong candidate. Darwin was, understandably, thrilled by the prospect. This was exactly the kind of adventure and scientific exploration he had been dreaming of since reading Humboldt. But there was a significant hurdle. His father initially refused permission. Robert Darwin viewed the voyage as a reckless and dangerous scheme that would derail Charles's plans for a clerical career and expose him to significant physical danger. Imagine the tension in that household. It was only after Charles's maternal uncle, Josiah Wedgwood II, the same uncle who represented the industrial wealth and rational spirit, interceded and persuaded Robert Darwin that the voyage would be a valuable and respectable experience rather than a mere indulgence. With his father's reluctant blessing, Darwin secured his place aboard the Beagle. The voyage was expected to last approximately 2 years. It would, in the end, last nearly 5. HMS Beagle departed from Plymouth, England, on December 27, 1831. Darwin was 22 years old, full of youthful enthusiasm, despite his initial bouts of seasickness. This was one of the most consequential scientific journeys in history, though at the time it was framed primarily as a hydrographic survey mission, a mapping expedition, rather than a voyage of biological discovery. Darwin suffered terribly from seasickness for much of the voyage, a fact that often surprises those who later imagine him as an intrepid explorer perfectly suited to life at sea. But here's the crucial part. Whenever the Beagle put into port, Darwin would throw himself into intensive fieldwork on land. It was these countless shore excursions, rather than his time on the ship itself, that generated the observations on which his later theories would rest. He was like a sponge, soaking up every detail. He collected specimens of plants, animals, fossils, and rocks obsessively, carefully labeling and preserving them for shipment back to England, where his mentor Henslow served as the custodian of the growing collection. This wasn't just collecting, it was systematic data gathering on an unprecedented scale. The Beagle's route took Darwin through an extraordinary range of environments, each one offering new insights. In Brazil, he was awestruck by the sheer biodiversity and lushness of the tropical rainforest, describing it in his journal with an almost religious sense of wonder. He was captivated by the vibrant life, the complexity of the ecosystems. Yet amidst this natural beauty, he was horrified by the brutality of the slavery he witnessed there, which, as we mentioned, deepened his lifelong abolitionist convictions. This moral dimension of his observations is often overlooked, but was a significant part of his experience. In Argentina, he made a major paleontological discovery, unearthing the fossilized remains of enormous extinct mammals, creatures like Megatherium, a giant ground sloth, and Glyptodon, an armored mammal resembling a colossal armadillo. These fossils presented a profound puzzle to Darwin. The extinct creatures bore a striking resemblance to smaller living species still found in the same regions of South America. This raised early, fundamental questions in his mind about the relationship between extinct and living forms and the curious geographic distribution of species. Why did these giant, ancient versions of existing animals live in the same place? It suggested a continuity, a lineage, rather than entirely separate creations. Then in the Andes, Darwin observed marine fossils embedded in rock strata high above sea level. This wasn't just a curiosity, it was direct, undeniable evidence that entire mountain ranges had been thrust upward over immense stretches of geological time. This observation confirmed for him the ideas he had been reading in Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology, a book Henslow had given him before departure, with the caution that he should read it, but not necessarily believe its more radical claims. Lyell argued for uniformitarianism, the revolutionary idea that the Earth's geological features were shaped gradually over immense periods of time by the same natural processes still observable today, rather than by sudden, catastrophic events. Darwin found overwhelming confirmation of Lyell's framework throughout his travels, and this exposure to the concept of deep geological time became an essential intellectual foundation for his later biological theorizing. If the Earth itself had been gradually reshaped over eons, might not living species have been gradually reshaped as well? It was a profound intellectual leap, connecting geology to biology. In 1835, the Beagle reached the Galapagos Islands, an isolated volcanic archipelago off the coast of Ecuador. Although Darwin spent barely 5 weeks there, the Galapagos would become permanently and somewhat mythologically associated with his theory of evolution, perhaps more so in popular memory than the actual historical record fully justifies. There's this pervasive image of Darwin having an aha moment with the finches on the islands. The reality is more nuanced, and perhaps more illustrative of his patient, cumulative method. Darwin did note that the tortoises and mockingbirds varied subtly from island to island. Local officials reportedly told him that they could identify which island a giant tortoise had come from simply by the shape of its shell. This was a direct, local observation of island-specific variation. He also collected finches from several islands. But, and this is key, contrary to popular legend, he did not fully appreciate at the time how significant the variation among these finches would prove to be. In fact, he failed to carefully label which islands many of his finch specimens came from, a detail he later regretted. It was only later, after his return to England, when ornithologist John Gould examined the specimens, that the full significance began to crystallize. Gould determined that what Darwin had assumed were several different types of birds, wrens, blackbirds, finches, were in fact all closely related species of finch, each adapted to a different ecological niche with a distinctly shaped beak. This realization, arrived at gradually after his return rather than in a single, dramatic epiphany on the islands themselves, became one of the pivotal pieces of evidence in the development of his theory. It showed how isolated populations, over time, could diverge and adapt to their specific environments, leading to the formation of new species. The Beagle continued its survey through the Pacific, stopping in Tahiti, New Zealand, and Australia, before rounding the Cape of Good Hope and returning to England in October 1836. Darwin arrived home a changed man, not merely more well-traveled, but intellectually transformed. He had filled notebooks with observations, shipped home thousands of specimens, and crucially, had begun to develop a private suspicion, one he dared not yet voice publicly, that species were not fixed and immutable creations, but were instead capable of changing over time. The journey had been his crucible. Upon his return to England, Darwin was already something of a minor scientific celebrity. This was thanks to the specimens and geological reports he had sent home during the voyage, which had already been circulated among British scientific circles by Henslow. He quickly set about the immense task of cataloging his vast collections and consulting with specialists, Gould for birds, Richard Owen for fossil mammals, and others, to properly identify and describe what he had gathered. This period of collaboration and detailed analysis was crucial. It wasn't enough to just collect. He needed to understand what he had. It was during these immediate post-Beagle years that Darwin began quietly and privately developing his theory of evolution by natural selection. In July 1837, he opened his first notebook on the transmutation of species. This was a private, exploratory space, a sanctuary where he could speculate freely, sketch out tentative evolutionary trees, and work through the implications of species changing over time without fear of the public censure such ideas would surely provoke. Darwin understood, with an accuracy that later proved entirely correct, that a theory suggesting humans and animals shared common ancestry and had not been separately and specially created would be received as a direct assault on both religious orthodoxy and the social order of Victorian Britain. He knew he was treading on dangerous ground. A pivotal moment, a true eureka instance, came in September 1838. Darwin was reading, purely for recreational purposes mind you, the essay on the principle of population by the economist Thomas Malthus. Malthus argued that human populations, if left unchecked, would grow exponentially and inevitably outstrip the available food supply, leading to a perpetual struggle for existence in which not everyone could survive to reproduce. Darwin, in a flash of insight, immediately recognized that this same principle of a struggle for existence applied to the entire natural world, not merely human populations. Think about it. Nature is not a benevolent, endless provider. Resources are finite. If more individual organisms are born in each generation than can possibly survive and reproduce, then there must be a weeding out process. And crucially, if those individuals possessing some slight variation that gave them even a marginal advantage in that struggle, perhaps a slightly longer beak, a slightly better camouflage, a slightly stronger immune system, were more likely to survive and pass on their traits to their offspring, then over countless generations, this process, which Darwin termed natural selection, would gradually accumulate these small advantageous variations, eventually producing new species entirely distinct from their ancestors. Darwin later described this moment of insight as the point, "At last I had a theory by which to work." It was the missing piece, the mechanism that explained how change could occur, not randomly, but directionally. Yet having the essential theoretical insight and being ready to publish it were two very different things. Darwin spent the next 2 decades methodically gathering an overwhelming body of supporting evidence, testing his ideas against an enormous range of natural phenomena, and refining his argument, all while remaining largely silent about it in public. Historians have long debated why Darwin delayed so long before publishing. Was it genuine scientific caution and a desire to build an airtight case, anticipating every possible objection? Was it fear of social and religious backlash, knowing the storm it would unleash? Was it anxiety about upsetting his devoutly religious wife, Emma? Or was it some combination of these factors? Most likely, all of these motivations played some role. He was a meticulous scientist, a cautious man, and a loving husband, navigating a truly revolutionary idea in a deeply conservative society. In 1839, Darwin married his first cousin, Emma Wedgwood, the daughter of Josiah Wedgwood II, the same uncle who had helped persuade Darwin's father to allow him to join the Beagle voyage. The marriage proved to be a close and enduring partnership. Emma was intelligent, musically accomplished, and deeply religious, and while she came to have serious reservations about the theological implications of Charles's evolving scientific views, reservations she expressed candidly to him in letters that Darwin kept and treasured throughout his life. The couple maintained a warm and mutually supportive relationship until Charles's death more than 4 decades later. This speaks volumes about their connection, that profound intellectual and spiritual differences could coexist with such deep affection and respect. The Darwins settled first in London before moving in 1842 to Down House, a country residence in the village of Down in Kent, where Charles would live for the remainder of his life. The move to the countryside suited Darwin's increasingly fragile health, which had been in a gradual decline since his return from the Beagle voyage. He suffered from a bewildering array of chronic ailments, including severe stomach pain, vomiting, headaches, skin problems, and heart palpitations that plagued him for decades. Modern scholars have debated extensively the cause of these mysterious illnesses, with proposed explanations ranging from Chagas disease, possibly contracted during his South American travels, to cyclical vomiting syndrome, to psychosomatic anxiety related to the immense stress of his controversial work. Whatever its cause, this chronic illness confined Darwin largely to Down House and forced him to adopt a highly disciplined daily routine of work interspersed with rest, walks, and hydrotherapy treatments. This reclusive lifestyle, though born of illness, ironically allowed him the sustained, focused time required for his painstaking research. Charles and Emma had 10 children together, of whom 7 survived to adulthood. Darwin was, by the standards of his era, an unusually attentive and affectionate father, closely observing his children's development, with the same careful eye he brought to his scientific work. His observations of his infant son William's expressions and behaviors later informed his book on emotional expression, showing how his personal life and scientific inquiry were deeply intertwined. The death of his beloved daughter Annie in 1851, at just 10 years of age, from what was likely tuberculosis, devastated Darwin profoundly. Biographers often cite this as a significant factor in the further erosion of his already wavering religious faith. How could a benevolent God allow such suffering? This personal tragedy undoubtedly deepened his conviction that the natural world operated according to impersonal laws. Rather than rushing to publish his revolutionary theory, Darwin spent much of the 1840s and 1850s engaged in what might seem, on the surface, like a strange scientific detour. An exhaustive 8-year study of barnacles. Yes, barnacles. This project, which resulted in several substantial monographs on both living and fossil barnacle species, has sometimes been portrayed as a curious sidetrack. But it served Darwin well in multiple respects. It sharpened his skills in taxonomy, the classification of organisms, and comparative anatomy. It gave him first-hand, granular experience with the challenges of defining species boundaries and understanding variation within a group of organisms. And perhaps most importantly, it earned him immense credibility as a rigorous, serious naturalist rather than a mere speculative theorist. The barnacle work eventually won him the Royal Society's Royal Medal, a clear signal of his scientific standing. It was his way of saying, I can do the hard, detailed work, not just the grand theorizing. Throughout this period, Darwin continued to quietly develop his evolutionary theory, corresponding extensively with other naturalists, breeders, and horticulturalists to gather evidence about variation and heredity. He was particularly interested in the practices of pigeon breeders and animal husbandry more broadly, recognizing that the artificial selection practiced by breeders, who chose which animals to mate based on desired traits, offered a powerful analogy for the process of natural selection occurring without human intervention in the wild. Darwin himself took up pigeon breeding as a hobby, joining pigeon clubs and immersing himself in this practical world to better understand the mechanics of selective breeding. He saw these breeders as unwitting agents of evolution, demonstrating how dramatic changes could be wrought over generations through consistent selection. By the mid-1850s, encouraged by close friends and confidants, including the botanist Joseph Dalton Hooker and the geologist Charles Lyell, Darwin finally began drafting a comprehensive book laying out his theory in full. He had shared his basic ideas privately with Hooker as early as 1844, and had even written a lengthy private essay outlining the theory that year, sealed with instructions for it to be published in the event of his death. But he had resisted going public. Now, at last, he began the serious work of writing what he anticipated would be an enormous, multi-volume treatise, a definitive statement of his life's work. Darwin's careful, unhurried pace was abruptly disrupted in June 1858, a moment often referred to as the Wallace Crisis. He received a letter and an accompanying manuscript from Alfred Russel Wallace, a naturalist then working in the Malay archipelago. Wallace, independently and on the other side of the world, had arrived at a theory of evolution through natural selection strikingly similar to Darwin's own. Wallace's insight, reportedly crystallized during a fever-induced insight while he was recalling Malthus's population principle, the very same source of inspiration that had sparked Darwin's own theoretical breakthrough 2 decades earlier, was a stunning coincidence. Darwin was thrown into genuine distress. 20 years of careful, patient work suddenly seemed at risk of being overshadowed or entirely eclipsed by another man's simultaneous discovery. Imagine the feeling, all that painstaking effort, all those private notebooks, all the evidence meticulously gathered, potentially rendered secondary. Torn between his sense of scientific honor and his desire to receive due credit for 2 decades of labor, Darwin turned to his friends Lyell and Hooker for guidance. They arranged a solution that has since been debated by historians for its fairness. A joint presentation was made to the Linnean Society of London on July 1, 1858, featuring extracts from Darwin's unpublished 1844 essay and his correspondence, alongside Wallace's newly submitted paper. This effectively established both men as co-discoverers of the theory of natural selection, while giving Darwin priority based on his earlier private writings. Notably, neither Darwin nor Wallace was present at the reading. Darwin was at home, grieving the recent death of his infant son from scarlet fever, a truly tragic personal circumstance. Wallace was still abroad in the Malay archipelago, unaware the arrangement had even taken place until well afterward. To his credit, Wallace responded graciously when he learned of the arrangement, and the two men maintained a respectful, even warm, professional relationship for the rest of their lives, with Wallace consistently acknowledging Darwin's primacy in developing and substantiating the theory. The Wallace crisis was a moment of intense pressure, but it ultimately spurred Darwin into action. He abandoned his plans for an exhaustive multi-volume treatise, and instead rushed to complete a condensed, more accessible single-volume version of his argument, which he referred to as an abstract of the fuller work he had intended to write. This abstract became On the Origin of Species. On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life, was published on November 24, 1859, by John Murray. The entire first print run of 1,250 copies reportedly sold out on the very first day, a testament to the intense curiosity and anticipation the book generated even before publication. Fueled in part by the earlier Linnean Society announcement and by rumors circulating within scientific circles about Darwin's long-gestating theory, the world was ready, perhaps unknowingly, for this profound shift in understanding. The book laid out Darwin's argument with remarkable care and rhetorical skill. Rather than opening with abstract theory, Darwin began with the familiar, everyday phenomenon of artificial selection in domesticated plants and animals. He drew on his extensive research into pigeon breeding and agricultural practice to demonstrate how selective breeding could produce dramatic changes in a population over relatively short spans of time. This was a brilliant rhetorical move. taking something observable and understandable to his audience and using it as a stepping stone. From this accessible starting point, he built his case for natural selection operating in the wild. Given the Malthusian struggle for existence, the idea that more individuals are born than can survive, given the variation that exists among individuals within any population, and given that some of this variation is heritable, those individuals best suited to their environment would be more likely to survive and reproduce, gradually shifting the characteristics of a population over successive generations. Extended over the vast stretches of time that geologists like Lyell had shown to be available, Darwin argued this process could account for the entire diversity of life on Earth, including the origin of new species, without requiring any intervention beyond the ordinary laws of nature. It was a complete, naturalistic explanation for the incredible complexity and variety of life. Notably, Darwin was cautious in The Origin about directly addressing human evolution. He limited himself to a single understated sentence near the end of the book, predicting that light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history. This reticence was almost certainly strategic, an attempt to let the broader theory gain acceptance before confronting its most explosive and personally threatening implication head-on. He knew the powder keg he was sitting on. The reception of The Origin was immediate, intense, and deeply divided. Many clergy and conservative thinkers condemned the book as an assault on Scripture and on humanity's special, divinely ordained place in creation. The idea that humans might share ancestry with apes was anathema to many. Others, including a number of scientists, objected on more technical grounds, questioning whether Darwin had adequately explained the mechanisms of heredity, a gap that would not be filled until the rediscovery of Gregor Mendel's genetics work decades later, or whether the geological timescales required for natural selection to operate were truly as vast as Darwin and Lyell claimed. But Darwin's theory also found passionate defenders. Chief among them was the biologist Thomas Henry Huxley, who became such a vigorous public champion of Darwinian evolution that he earned the nickname Darwin's Bulldog. Because Darwin's chronic ill health and natural aversion to public confrontation kept him largely confined to Down House and disinclined to engage in public debate, it fell to Huxley and other allies to defend the theory in the public arena. The most famous of these confrontations occurred at a meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science at Oxford in 1860, where Huxley engaged in a celebrated verbal clash with Samuel Wilberforce, the Bishop of Oxford, over the implications of Darwin's theory for human ancestry. This exchange has become legendary in the popular history of science, even though the precise details of what was said have been embellished and disputed by historians over time. It was a cultural flashpoint, a battle for the very soul of scientific and religious thought. Following The Origin, Darwin continued to write and publish extensively, applying and extending his evolutionary framework to a range of specific topics. In 1868, he published The Variation of Animals and Plants Under Domestication, a lengthy and detailed exploration of artificial selection that also introduced his provisional and ultimately incorrect hypothesis of pangenesis as a proposed mechanism for heredity. This was an attempt to fill the crucial gap in his theory regarding how traits were actually passed from parents to offspring, a puzzle that Darwin was never able to satisfactorily solve during his lifetime. He knew heredity was key, but the precise mechanism eluded him. In 1871, Darwin finally addressed the question he had so carefully avoided in The Origin: human evolution. The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex argued explicitly that humans had descended from earlier primate ancestors, sharing common ancestry with apes. This book also introduced the theory of sexual selection, a proposed mechanism distinct from natural selection for survival, in which certain traits evolve because they enhance an individual's ability to attract mates and reproduce successfully, even if those traits offer no direct survival advantage or are even mildly disadvantageous for survival. Think of the elaborate plumage of peacocks or the enormous antlers of male deer. These traits might make an animal more vulnerable to predators, but they are incredibly attractive to potential mates, thus increasing reproductive success. The book provoked, predictably, even greater public controversy than the origin had, given its direct and unambiguous assertion of humanity's animal ancestry. It was widely satirized in the press, with cartoons depicting Darwin himself in an ape's body becoming a staple of popular caricature. The idea of being related to apes was, for many, simply too much to bear. The following year, in 1872, Darwin published The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, a pioneering work of comparative psychology. This book argued that human emotional expressions, smiling, frowning, blushing, were evolutionarily continuous with emotional displays observed in animals, rather than being uniquely human or divinely instilled traits. It drew on Darwin's careful observations of his own children's expressions as infants, as well as on an early and innovative use of photography to document human facial expressions systematically. This was groundbreaking, showing the deep shared roots of our emotional lives with the rest of the animal kingdom. Darwin's later years also saw him return to a subject that might seem an unlikely capstone to a revolutionary scientific career: earthworms. His final book, published in 1881, just months before his death, was titled The Formation of Vegetable Mold Through the Action of Worms. This book demonstrated, through decades of patient observation and experimentation, the surprisingly significant role earthworms play in shaping soil and landscape over long periods of time through their burrowing and digestive activity. The book was, in its own modest way, a final demonstration of the intellectual approach that had defined Darwin's entire career. The recognition that vast and consequential changes in nature could result from the patient, gradual accumulation of small, seemingly insignificant effects over immense stretches of time, precisely the same logic that underpinned natural selection itself. It was a microcosm of his grand theory, played out in his own garden. Those who knew Darwin personally consistently described him as gentle, modest, and notably lacking in the combativeness or self-promotion that might be expected of a man whose ideas provoked such fierce public controversy. He avoided public debate not out of cowardice, but largely due to his genuinely poor health. And he relied on a close circle of scientific friends and correspondents, Hooker, Lyell, Huxley, and the American botanist Asa Gray among them, to advocate for his ideas and to provide the intellectual sounding board he needed to refine his thinking. This network of supportive colleagues was absolutely vital to his work. Darwin's working methods were characterized by extraordinary patience and thoroughness. He maintained voluminous correspondence with naturalists, breeders, gardeners, and colonial administrators around the world, gathering observations and specimens that fed into his research on an enormous range of subjects, from orchids and carnivorous plants to the social behavior of ants. He was a devoted user of the scientific method in its most painstaking form, often spending years testing hypotheses through careful experimentation before committing his conclusions to print. He also kept detailed notebooks throughout his life, a practice dating back to his voyage on the Beagle, which allowed him to trace and revisit the gradual development of his own ideas over decades. He was a master of iterative thinking, constantly refining and testing. Darwin's relationship with religion evolved considerably over the course of his life. He had trained for the clergy as a young man and held broadly conventional Christian beliefs during the Beagle voyage, but his faith eroded gradually over subsequent decades, influenced by his scientific findings, by philosophical reflection on the problem of suffering, sharpened painfully by the death of his daughter Annie, and by his growing conviction that the natural world operated according to impersonal natural laws rather than through direct divine intervention. By the end of his life, Darwin identified most accurately as an agnostic, a term coined by his friend Huxley rather than as an atheist, expressing genuine uncertainty about ultimate questions of design and purpose in the universe, rather than outright denial of a creator's existence. It was a nuanced, deeply personal journey of faith and reason. Despite the controversy surrounding his theory, Darwin received substantial recognition from the scientific establishment during his lifetime. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1839, and later received the Society's Royal Medal, Copley Medal, and other honors recognizing his scientific contributions across botany, geology, and zoology, as well as evolutionary biology. He became a respected, even revered figure among the scientific community, even as he remained a controversial and sometimes reviled figure among more religiously conservative segments of the public. It's a fascinating dichotomy: scientific acclaim alongside public opprobrium. Charles Darwin died at Down House on April 19, 1882, at the age of 73, from complications related to heart disease that had likely been compounding with his long-standing chronic ailments for years. Although Darwin and his family had expected he would be buried locally, near Down House, a group of his scientific colleagues and admirers in Parliament successfully campaigned for him to be given the singular honor of burial in Westminster Abbey, the resting place of British monarchs and its most eminent citizens. Darwin was laid to rest there on April 26, 1882, near the graves of Isaac Newton and John Herschel, a fitting final acknowledgement of the towering place he had earned among the greatest natural philosophers in British history, an honor that stood in striking contrast to the intense religious controversy his ideas had generated during his lifetime. It was the ultimate recognition of his profound impact on human knowledge. The legacy of Charles Darwin is truly difficult to overstate. The theory of evolution by natural selection, first laid out systematically in On the Origin of Species, remains the unifying framework of modern biology. It provides the explanatory foundation for fields ranging from genetics and molecular biology to ecology, paleontology, and medicine. It's not just a theory, it's the bedrock upon which our understanding of life is built. The rediscovery of Gregor Mendel's work on genetic inheritance in the early 20th century filled the crucial gap in Darwin's theory regarding the mechanism of heredity that had eluded him during his lifetime. The subsequent fusion of Darwinian natural selection with Mendelian genetics, known as the modern synthesis, cemented evolutionary theory as the central organizing principle of biological science by the mid-20th century. Later discoveries in molecular biology, including the structure of DNA and the subsequent development of genomics, have provided overwhelming independent confirmation of common descent and natural selection, vindicating Darwin's core insights in ways he could scarcely have imagined. Every new genetic sequence, every fossil discovery, every ecological study reinforces the power of his original idea. Darwin's influence extends well beyond biology itself. His ideas have profoundly shaped philosophy, psychology, sociology, and even economics. However, sometimes these influences have been tragically distorted. The misapplication of evolutionary concepts to justify social hierarchies and eugenic policies under the banner of social Darwinism represents one of the darker distortions of his legacy in the decades following his death. It's crucial to remember that Darwin himself did not originate this movement, and would likely have found such applications abhorrent. He was a scientist, not a social engineer, and his theory was descriptive of nature, not prescriptive for human society. At the same time, Darwin's work has continued to generate ongoing public debate, particularly in the United States, where the teaching of evolution in public schools has remained a recurring flashpoint in cultural and legal battles between scientific and religious communities well into the 21st century. This ongoing tension highlights the enduring power and sometimes uncomfortable implications of his ideas. Within science itself, however, evolutionary theory faces no serious rival as an explanation for the diversity and interrelatedness of life on Earth. It is supported by converging lines of evidence from paleontology, comparative anatomy, embryology, biogeography, and molecular genetics. It continues to be refined, extended, and applied by working biologists across virtually every subfield of the discipline. The Galapagos finches that helped inspire Darwin's original insight remain a celebrated case study in evolutionary biology to this day, closely studied by subsequent generations of scientists, documenting evolution occurring in real time under the pressure of changing environmental conditions. It's a living, breathing field of study, constantly evolving, much like the life it seeks to understand. Darwin himself remains a figure of considerable historical fascination, not merely for the revolutionary nature of his ideas, but for the very ordinary human qualities, patience, caution, self-doubt, and quiet perseverance that carried him to his extraordinary conclusions. He was not a man who sought controversy or courted fame. Indeed, he seems to have dreaded both. Yet through decades of painstaking observation, careful correspondence, and rigorous self-criticism, he built an argument so thoroughly substantiated that it fundamentally and permanently altered humanity's understanding of its own origins and its place within the natural world. So what are the key takeaways from this journey through Darwin's life? First, Darwin's story is a powerful illustration of a particular model of scientific achievement. Not the sudden dramatic flash of genius, but the slow, deliberate accumulation of evidence, sustained over decades of careful, patient work. His journey from a boy more interested in beetles than in Latin declensions, to a young man whose seasickness on HMS Beagle belied the momentous observations he was making on land, to an aging, chronically ill naturalist, quietly working through the implications of earthworms in his garden at Down House, was defined by this patient attention to the natural world in all its complexity. Second, the theory he developed, that the extraordinary diversity of life on Earth arose through the simple, impersonal, and endlessly repeated process of natural selection acting on heritable variation, remains one of the most powerful and well-substantiated ideas in the history of science. It's a testament to the elegance and explanatory power of natural law. And finally, more than a century and a half after the publication of On the Origin of Species, Darwin's insight continues to illuminate the deep unity underlying the living world. It's a fitting legacy for a life spent looking closely, thinking carefully, and crucially, refusing to publish before the evidence was overwhelming. He taught us not just about evolution, but about the scientific method itself, the power of observation, the importance of evidence, and the courage to follow where the facts lead, no matter how unsettling the destination. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the extraordinary life and enduring legacy of Charles Darwin. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep unveiling the wonders of our world.